Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed new redistricting maps into law on Monday that experts say cement Republican control in the state for the next decade. Texas Republicans, almost all of whom are white, have done so by diminishing the voting power of people of color, despite people of color accounting for 95% of the state's population growth over the last 10 years. Voters in Virginia tried to prevent this same thing from happening in their state. In 2020, Virginians approved a bipartisan commission to thwart partisan gerrymandering, but the Virginia Redistricting Commission failed to meet its October 10 deadline after months of gridlock. Virginia Delegate Marsha Price, a member of the Legislative Black Caucus, told the Washington Post that commissioners could not agree on a map that accurately reflects the state's growing racial diversity and changing political demographics. Because they came away with nothing, the state Supreme Court will now be forced to draw the maps. Over in North Carolina, the GOP-controlled legislature has sworn to take a race-blind approach that would not use race or partisan data to create new political maps. Yet, their proposed maps skew heavily towards Republicans by siphoning Democratic votes in Charlotte, the state's largest city and largest black population, into 3 or 4 U.S. House districts. The result would give Republicans a 10-4 advantage in a state that Donald Trump won in 2020 by a slim margin. Casting a shadow over all of this is the voting rights bill hanging in the balance in Congress. The Freedom to Vote Act contains key provisions that would ban partisan gerrymandering and reform nonpartisan redistricting. Back with us to discuss, Chuck Rocha and John Dorman. So, John, let's start with you. What is your take on all of the redistricting efforts happening in the states? The voting rights legislation in Congress still has not passed. These maps will now start to be signed into law, and that will govern the 2022 midterms.
Yes. So Charles, what we saw after the presidential election, we saw Texas, we saw Georgia, we saw Florida, and a multitude of other states enact restrictive voting bills. So these bills were intended to, to dilute the vote. But also, when you look at redistricting, and especially in a state like Virginia, the Redistricting Commission failed because of partisan, even though it was independent, supposed to be independent, if it completely fell apart. So what you're seeing in these states are a lot of Republican legislators are cracking districts. So they're basically, like you said, they're splitting them up, diluting the vote. And like in Texas, you saw a majority of the minority vote, which represented the majority, most of the population growth in those states. Basically, there is no district being created that accounts for that population growth. So this is something that's really problematic in many ways for Democratic legislators, because you saw Sheila Jackson Lee and you saw Al Green. Their districts are being modified, and those were things, especially in Texas. There were a lot of historically Democratic districts that had remained intact for a while. Now you're going to see these really significant changes, and especially in a state like Virginia, where again Joe Biden won in 2020 and Democrats have been ascendant. Now you're going to see the state Supreme Court, which has a majority of appointees of Republican governors. They could potentially draw the maps. So that's going to be a huge disadvantage for Democrats.
So, Chuck, every year, every 10 years, they redraw these maps. Every 10 years, there is just a raft of legislation saying that these maps are not fair for this reason or that reason. Sometimes the people who are complaining win the case, but not always. And so some of these maps and some of these districts survive. How do we break out of this cycle? If Texas or Virginia or North Carolina draw districts that favor Republicans to such a degree that they basically lock in the control, those would presumably be the same people in control the next time you get ready to draw the maps.
Charles, this is such a good topic. I live these nerdy numbers every single day. I've been running campaigns for a long time. And let me center this argument with everything that's wrong in Washington, D.C. comes back to redistricting. And let me make my case. My case is this: the reason why we can't get reconciliation through or something easy like an infrastructure is because Republicans and Democrats are both in super safe districts because either their state's controlled by Republicans, they get really safe Republican seats, or Democratic control and they get really safe Democratic seats. So neither one of those parties can be beat in a general election, but they can be beat in their own primary if they're not beholden enough to that party. So take the Republicans, for example. If you have a common sense Republican who's trying to do the right thing, try to reach out to Democrats, well, if they do that, then somebody from the right, the Donald Trump part of the party, will primary them and go, that fellow over there ain't really Republican. He's working with Democrats. We'll beat him. So that causes everybody to run to their corner and not have any middle ground. So that's the problem. That's the problem with DC as a whole. The solution is to come up with real bipartisan commissions that take these lawmakers out of the decision-making process and politics as a whole out of it. In Colorado, they've got a commission. They got one new congressional seat that they had to create. And guess what they created? A 50-50 district. One of my best friends, Chaz Tedesco, is running in a seat out there, the new Colorado 8th, which is only Democrat plus 1.3. That means that district is literally half Republican, half Democrats, and that we need to have more districts like that because whoever represents that seat will have to make sure they're making both Republicans and Democrats allow all of their constituents happy.
So John, what specifically is in the Freedom to Vote Act that is supposed to address this issue?
So in the freedom in that particular act, what they would like to do, they want to ban partisan gerrymandering. They want to establish early voting. They want there to be.
But let me interrupt one second.
States,
when they say ban partisan gerrymandering, does that mean that there will be a uniform body that draws maps, or how? I just don't understand the actual mechanics of saying ban partisan gerrymandering. What does that mean?
Well, I think it depends from state to state. In many ways, they want most. I know a lot of the Democratic legislators. They basically just want fair maps. So they want a bipartisan or a nonpartisan body. In Virginia, that's something that they tried to get. And you see the results. Unfortunately, they weren't able to come to an agreement. So what those laws, what that law would actually do, they basically just want a smooth and a even playing ground. They don't feel like they've been getting that in states like, look at Wisconsin. That's a state that is pretty much 50-50 on the presidential level, and Republicans have an overwhelming majority in the districts just because of the way that they were drawn. And of course, there was a Republican legislature, and at the time, Scott Walker, the former Republican governor, they signed those particular maps into law. And the same thing, you look at a state like Michigan, you look at a state like Ohio, where Republicans do have a pretty significant advantage, even if the state is relatively closer on the presidential level. And you saw that in Pennsylvania, where the maps that were drawn in the last decade were struck down, and Democrats ended up winning more seats in the 2018 midterm elections because they were able to get those maps struck down. So I think Democrats are trying to see in this next decade, right, how can we get that to not happen, where we can actually have maps at the beginning of the decade that are going to be fair.
Chuck Rocha and John Dorman, thank you both for two really important discussions tonight. I really appreciate your time.